Hey, good morning, friends. Welcome to another episode of Team Jesus Outdoors. Hey, friends, here at the end of 2017, as I reflect back on my fishing season, it occurs to me that I caught approximately 75 or maybe even 80% of the fish I caught this year on finesse tactics. I guess that's not terribly surprising given that I live in Michigan. The vast majority of the time I'm on the water, I'm fishing Lake St. Clair. So I guess it comes as no giant surprise. Nonetheless, about somewhere between 75 and 80% of the fish that I caught in 2017, I caught on finesse tactics. Mostly drop shot, Neko Rig, and Ned Rig. Hey, friends. Hey, don't forget to click the like button. Leave a comment in the comment box below and let me know what your favorite finesse tactic is. Ned Rig, Neko Rig, drop shot, shaky head. What is your go-to finesse tactic? So, a great question is, when you've decided that it's time to switch to finesse tactics, which finesse tactic do you use first? In a situation where I don't have a lot of wind, a Ned Rig is going to be one of my favorite options. And there are tons of ways to Ned Rig. Two of my favorite Ned rigging baits. One is Case Plastics Little Stick, which is just a shorter version of the Case Plastics Magic Stick. This makes an excellent Ned rigging bait, and so does the original Gets It tube or any other narrow, thin-walled tube. Here's a Gets It on an 1/8 ounce mushroom head tube. That is a killer finesse bait. I use it a lot, particularly in the spring when I feel that bass are chasing crawfish. The Ned Rig is my preferred option if I'm fishing a fairly hard bottom and there aren't a lot of weeds. If I have a little bit more weeds to contend with, or if I have a little bit of wind to contend with, then a Neko Rig is one of my favorite methods. If you combine a Neko Rig with a weedless Neko Rig hook, this is a weedless Neko hook by VMC. But the Neko Rig in and of itself is a relatively weedless approach, even with an exposed hook. But you combine that with a weedless hook, and now you've got a really weedless presentation. In essence, a Neko Rig is nothing more than your preference of worm. Mine happens to be the Case Plastics Magic Stick, 4.5 inch. A Neko weight or nail weight. These happen to be Eagle Claw 1/16 ounce lead nail weights. I like the lead so I can clip off as much as I like. I always use the original O-Wacky tool to put an O-ring on my worm. I prefer a straight shanked hook, and essentially the finished product looks something like this. Similar to the Ned Rig is the good old standard shaky head rig, or what we'd call back in the old days, we'd call it a jig worm. But if you take a smaller profile worm, like similar to a zoom trick worm on a shaky head jig, leave the hook buried just below the surface of the worm, that's also a pretty weedless approach. I've caught a lot of bass in the grass on that approach too. The downside of the Ned Rig or a shaky head jig, to me, is if you have a lot of wind. You're typically throwing 16th ounce jigs, very, very light jigs. It gets pretty difficult to be accurate in the wind. To me, the beauty of a drop shot is the versatility. The drop shot works great in a situation where the drop shot works great in wind. The drop shot works great in the grass. Sometimes I will drop shot with an extra wide gap style VMC spin shot hook, just so that I can Texas rig my bait. I'll take a regular 4.5 inch magic stick, Texas rigged on my drop shot. That's an excellent weedless presentation. You can present just about any style worm you like on that. My favorite hooks for drop shotting are the VMC spin shot hooks. My favorite size is a 1 or a 1/0, but I'll go down as far as a 2, on occasion even a size 4. For demonstration purposes, I tied a high-vis braided leader, high-vis braid to represent my main line, and I tied a heavy mono for a drop line to a tungsten drop shot weight. My favorite thing about a drop shot rig is the versatility of it. I use a drop shot rig for a lot of different situations. One of my favorite presentations when I'm fishing smallmouth or largemouth on beds is a drop shot. In that instance, I'll use a much shorter dropper line, a little bit heavier drop shot weight. Commonly go to like a 3/16 or even a 3/8 ounce drop shot weight, which lets me keep the bait stationary. It's easy with a 3/8 ounce weight. It's easy to keep the bait stationary and yet jiggle it quite a bit, impart a lot of movement to the worm. I will also use a drop shot rig a lot of times in place of a Texas rig, in the same type areas and conditions that you would use a Texas rig. In the spring, when you have sparse emergent vegetation coming up, in the spring when you first start having lily pads come up, the lily pads are pretty sparse. That's a great instance for a little bit heavier drop shot rig. I'll throw that on 14-pound fluorocarbon on a bait caster. A drop shot rig is also excellent anytime on the Great Lakes, on Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie. Usually if I'm fishing deep water on the Great Lakes, I'll start with a 1/2 ounce tungsten drop shot weight, and I'll go up from there if I need to. Sometimes on St. Clair and Erie, I'll use a drop shot with the extra wide gap spin shot hook to present a fluke or a tube. That's a great presentation. That's an excellent presentation on the Great Lakes. I think the easiest way to determine which rig is right for your situation is by process of elimination. So first I'll look at the wind conditions. Do I have a lot of wind? If I have a lot of wind, then I'm going to rule out a shaky head or a Ned Rig. If you have to upsize the size of your Ned Rig to compensate for the wind, then you kind of defeat some of the purpose of throwing the Ned Rig. So in a lot of wind, the Neko Rig or the drop shot rig is going to be a better option. Next, I'll look at the bottom composition. Most finesse presentations work best with a hard bottom, a hard sandy or gravel bottom. Just by nature of finesse tactics, that's when I think they're at their best. But again, I will use them in weeds. If the weeds are sparse, any of the 3 of these tactics will work just fine. When the weeds get a little bit heavier, another tactic that I will go to that's kind of fallen out of favor over the last few years is the Mojo Rig. In a situation where you have a little bit more weeds, making it difficult to use the exposed Ned Rig or even the shaky head. And a drop shot has its limitations as far as really thick weeds too. That's a situation when I will often turn to a Mojo Rig. I will commonly use a Mojo Rig in a little bit thicker grass. I use a number 1 trocar. I use a number 1 trocar worm hook, offset worm hook, and I'll throw Zoom finesse worms or Zoom trick worm. Sometimes I'll throw the magic stick. Go to a Mojo Rig in a little bit heavier weeds. I use a fairly thin wire trocar offset worm hook, a 1/0 offset worm hook. I use it with some type of finesse worm, either a magic stick or a jack's worm. I'll fish it a lot with a trick worm. But I use the lightest Mojo weight that I can get away with. And the real trick is using a lighter hook, a lighter wire hook, so that you get a good hook penetration even on light spinning tackle. I think there are pros and cons to each of the finesse tactics. For simplicity, the Ned Rig's hard to beat. I mean, it just doesn't get much more simple than a very small worm and a little mushroom head jig. That's just as simple as it gets. You don't need to spend a ton of money in tackle to do this. I think that's probably one of the advantages to the Ned Rig. You do still have some options with a Ned Rig, like throwing a small tube on it. When it comes to Neko rigging, your options are probably a touch more limited. I almost always use a magic stick when I'm Neko rigging, and a lot of that's just preference. But either a magic stick or a jack's worm are my two favorite baits to Neko rig. The vast majority of the time I'm Neko rigging, that's what I'm going to use. Like I said, this is one of my favorites too, the larger version of the jack's worm. To me, my favorite thing about a drop shot is simply the versatility. You can just do anything with a drop shot rig. It isn't just a finesse bait. A drop shot rig can be ultra finesse all the way up to power fishing. Hey friends, I wish everybody a very happy new year. I hope in 2018 you all have an opportunity to spend more time on the water. My prayer for each one of you is that you take an opportunity in 2018 to grow closer to God. If you're new to the idea of faith, I hope you take some time in 2018 to explore your faith. But I think the most important thing that you can do in 2018 is make sure that you're in a good church, make sure you have your family in a good church, and invest a little bit more time in 2018 getting to know your God. Hey, thanks for watching another episode of Team Jesus Outdoors. Please click the like button. If you're not already a subscriber, I wish you would subscribe.
Know that it's me, I will never find my place, and I can't believe you would dare to show your face.